The 911 system exists for one reason: to connect you to a lifeline. But what if the lifeline itself is a trap? What if the voice crying for help is lying? And what if the call for rescue is the very thing that hides the crime? You are about to hear 3 911 calls that prove the most terrifying truth of all. Sometimes the call for help is the beginning of the horror, not the end of it. This is the story of a 911 call that begins with confusion and ends with a revelation so shocking, it redefined what investigators thought was possible. It's a case where the person who sounded most like a victim on the phone was actually orchestrating the entire tragedy from the start. The setting is a quiet, middle-class home in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The date is March 22nd, 2012. To the outside world, the Hadley family appeared to be the picture of suburban normalcy. Michelle Hadley, a 36-year-old mother, lived there with her husband and their 3 children. The day began like any other Thursday. The 2 older children went to school. The youngest, a 3-year-old boy named Jett, stayed home with his mother. There were no signs of impending disaster, no public arguments, no financial crises that neighbors could see. The house was simply a home until it became the center of a frantic police search and a psychological puzzle that seemed to make no sense. The call came in just after 11 a.m. Michelle's voice was the picture of frantic, breathless panic. She was crying, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of sheer terror. She told the operator that 2 masked men had just burst into her home. They had attacked her, she said, tying her up before fleeing. But the true horror, the detail that sent a chill through the dispatcher, was what she said next. "They took my baby," she gasped between sobs. "They took my little boy." The operator, trained to be an anchor in chaos, kept her voice steady. She asked for descriptions, for details of the men, for any clue. But Michelle's story was strangely vague. The men were tall, wearing dark clothes. The masks obscured their faces. She couldn't give a direction of travel, a vehicle description. Her narrative was an outline of a crime filled with terrifying blanks. Yet the raw emotion in her voice was undeniable. She sounded like a mother living through her worst nightmare. Police and SWAT teams descended on the Hadley home within minutes. They found the scene exactly as Michelle had described it, to a point. She was indeed bound with zip ties lying on the floor. The house showed signs of a struggle, but seasoned investigators felt an immediate instinctual dissonance. The ransacking of the home seemed staged, haphazard rather than purposeful. The bindings on Michelle's wrists, when closely examined, were loose enough that she could have possibly slipped out of them. The little boy was nowhere to be found. An Amber Alert was issued. The community was gripped by fear. A child had been stolen from his own home in broad daylight. For hours, the investigation operated on the assumption that Michelle was a victim. She was taken to the hospital, treated for minor injuries, and interviewed by detectives. Her story remained consistent, yet frustratingly devoid of actionable detail. Meanwhile, the search for Jett expanded. Helicopters circled, volunteers combed fields. Every passing minute tightened the knot of dread in the community's stomach. Then a break came. Not from a witness or a tip, but from a cold analysis of the evidence. Investigators reviewed the 911 tape, and they listened, not just to the words, but to what was underneath them. There, in the background of her own panicked call, audio experts detected something chilling, faint, but distinct. It was the sound of a child's voice, a little boy saying, "Mama," not in terror, not as part of a struggle, but calmly, innocently. And then, even more damning, they heard what sounded like the muffled, struggling cries of a child being smothered. These sounds were buried under Michelle's own loud sobs and pleas, but technology and careful listening brought them to the surface. The timeline shattered. If Jett was in the house, speaking to his mother during the 911 call, then her entire story of masked kidnappers was a lie. Confronted with this irrefutable audio evidence, Michelle Hadley's story collapsed. She was arrested and charged with the murder of her own son, Jett. His body was later discovered, confirming the worst. In 2014, she stood trial. The 911 recording was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a recording that demonstrated not just a lie, but a performance of grief staged over the actual sounds of the crime. Michelle Hadley was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will spend the rest of her natural life behind bars, a consequence of a deception that began with a phone call for help. The Michelle Hadley case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how the truth can hide in plain sight, or, in this case, in plain hearing. The 911 call was initially treated as a credible cry for help. It took forensic listening, a willingness to question the obvious narrative, to hear the terrible truth whispering beneath the screams. This case is not about a monster in a mask, but about a profound and calculated betrayal of the most sacred trust. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality that sometimes the most convincing performance of victimhood can be the ultimate weapon of a perpetrator. The silence that followed Jett's disappearance was not a mystery to be solved by searching the streets, but by listening with agonizing care to the story that was already on tape. A story that contained, within its layers, both the lie and the evidence that unraveled it. The second story is about a woman who called 911 to report an emergency medical situation. The operator heard her describe her own symptoms, but neither of them realized that the cure she was about to receive would be more deadly than the illness itself. The setting is Sacramento, California. The year is 2007, a time when radio station contests pushed the boundaries of entertainment for prizes that seemed, on the surface, absurdly generous. One such contest was called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. The premise was simple. Contestants had to drink large amounts of water over a short period without using the restroom. The prize was a Nintendo Wii, the hottest gaming console of the season. Among the finalists was a 28-year-old mother of 3 named Jennifer Strange. She was there to win that console for her children. For hours, Jennifer and other contestants drank bottle after bottle of water. The atmosphere was lighthearted, almost festive, but inside Jennifer's body, a silent, catastrophic process was beginning. The human kidney has a limit to how much water it can process. When that limit is violently exceeded, a condition called hyponatremia sets in. In simple terms, the body's essential sodium levels become lethally diluted. The brain begins to swell. There are no dramatic outward signs at first, just a growing internal confusion. Hours after the contest ended, Jennifer was back at her home. The festive atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, debilitating illness. She was experiencing a headache she described as the worst of her life, accompanied by intense nausea and dizziness. Her thinking was becoming foggy. Recognizing something was profoundly wrong, she did what any reasonable person would do. She dialed 911. The 911 operator answered with the standard greeting. Jennifer's voice was strained, thick with discomfort, but remarkably coherent. She described her symptoms with clear, clinical precision. The debilitating headache, the vomiting, the dizziness. She even mentioned the water drinking contest, providing the critical context. The operator, following protocol, categorized this as a medical emergency and dispatched an ambulance. Jennifer was told to stay on the line until help arrived. This is where the tragedy shifts from medical to systemic. The ambulance arrived promptly. Paramedics assessed Jennifer. She was in clear distress. But here, a critical misjudgment occurred. The paramedics, perhaps not fully grasping the unique and acute danger of hyponatremia, did not transport her to the hospital immediately. Instead, they reportedly suggested she might be suffering from a hangover or stress. They left the scene. Jennifer was now alone again, her condition deteriorating by the minute, having been failed by the very system she called for salvation. Not long after, a family member found Jennifer in a state of severe confusion. A second 911 call was made. This time, her condition was unmistakably critical. When paramedics returned, they found her unconscious. The race to the hospital was now a desperate sprint against an invisible clock. But the damage to her brain from the catastrophic swelling was already extensive and, as doctors would soon determine, irreversible. Jennifer Strange was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause, acute water intoxication leading to fatal hyponatremia. Her death was ruled a homicide, not in the traditional sense, but as a death caused by the actions of others. a criminal investigation was launched, focusing on the radio station staff who organized and supervised the contest. In the ensuing trial, 3 station employees were found guilty of misdemeanors. They received sentences of probation and community service. No one served jail time. The radio station settled a wrongful death lawsuit with Jennifer's family for a reported sum in the millions. Legally, the case was closed. The true legacy of Jennifer Strange's death is not found in a courtroom verdict, but in the profound, unsettling questions it forces us to ask. How could something as universally essential as water become a weapon? How could a plea for help so clearly communicated to a 911 operator fail to trigger the correct life-saving response at the next crucial step? Her story exposed a gap in common knowledge about a hidden danger and a potential blind spot in emergency medical protocols when faced with a non-traditional, man-made condition. Jennifer's case became a grim lesson taught in medical and paramedic schools worldwide. It changed how such contests are viewed, leading many broadcasters to implement strict safety rules. But at its heart, it remains a story of terrifying normalcy. A person followed the rules of a game, drank what she was told to drink, asked for help when she needed it, and was failed by a chain of understandable yet catastrophic misjudgments. It reminds us that tragedy sometimes doesn't wear a monstrous face. It can look like a game, sound like a friendly contest, and arrive in the most innocent of containers, a simple bottle of water. It began with a voice on the other end of the line, a voice that was unnervingly calm, almost detached, yet carried the unmistakable weight of pure, unspoken terror. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, a brief, fractured window into a moment of crisis happening in real time, somewhere out in the dark. But when the line went silent, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a silence that would stretch for years. Our setting is not a sprawling metropolis or a remote, isolated cabin, but a quiet residential street in a suburb of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was the early morning hours of December 12, 1989, a cold, still night where the only sounds were the faint whisper of the wind and the distant hum of a sleeping city. The houses on this street were modest, family homes, their windows dark, their occupants deep in sleep, completely unaware that in one of these homes, a very different kind of night was unfolding. The woman on the phone identified herself as Ruth Price. She was 74 years old, living alone in her home on Tennessee Street. To her neighbors, she was a quiet, private woman, a fixture of the community who had lived there for years. That night, her routine was no different from any other. She had locked her doors, turned off the lights, and settled in for the evening. There was no reason for anyone to believe this night would be anything but ordinary. Yet at some point, between the safety of her bedtime routine and the breaking of dawn, the ordinary shattered. The 911 call came in at 1:23 a.m. The operator answered, expecting perhaps a medical emergency or a report of a disturbance. Instead, she was met with Ruth's voice, steady but strained. Ruth didn't scream. She didn't cry. She spoke in a low, urgent monotone, reporting that someone was inside her home. She stated it as a simple, terrifying fact. There were no dramatic crashes, no shouts in the background. Just the profound, unsettling quiet of a house that was no longer empty, punctuated by Ruth's whispered words to the operator. The operator, trained to handle chaos, now had to navigate this chilling calm. She asked Ruth for her address, for a description of the intruder, for any detail that could help. But the information came in fragments. Ruth's attention was divided, her focus pulled away from the phone, as if she was listening, watching the darkness of her own hallway. She mentioned a door being open. She stated the man was still there, in the house with her, but she couldn't say where he was now. This uncertainty is where the true tension lies, not in a visible monster, but in the formless shifting threat just out of sight, in the spaces between Ruth's words. The pregnant pauses, the subtle intake of breath. The operator is a lifeline to the outside world, a voice of procedure and reassurance, but she is speaking into a void. She is trying to anchor Ruth in reality, to keep her connected, but the reality inside that house has become something else entirely. It has become a private, silent contest of wills, a waiting game in the dark. The operator promises that help is on the way, that police are en route. But in a situation like this, seconds stretch into eternities. Every creak of the house, every shift of shadow becomes a potential catastrophe. Then, the tone shifts. It is subtle, but definitive. Ruth's voice drops even lower. The words become more clipped. She is no longer just reporting, she is reacting. She says, "He's coming." It's not a scream, it's a statement of grim inevitability. In that moment, the abstract threat in the shadows coalesces into a direct imminent danger. The operator pleads with her. "Ruth? Ruth, talk to me. What's happening?" But the conversation is no longer a dialogue. It has become a monologue, with Ruth speaking past the operator, perhaps to the intruder himself, or simply to the unbearable reality of her situation. Her final audible words are a quiet, desperate plea. "Operator, please." And then, silence. Not the silence of a disconnected call, but an active listening silence. The line remains open. For over a minute, the operator calls into the void. "Ruth, can you hear me?" Only the faint, empty static of an open line answers. It is a silence more harrowing than any scream. It holds within it every possible outcome, every unthinkable scenario. It is the sound of a story cutting off at its most critical juncture, leaving the listener stranded on the edge of the unknown. When police arrived at the Tennessee Street address minutes later, they found a scene that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The front door of Ruth Price's home was unlocked. Inside, the house was dark, quiet, and showed subtle signs of disturbance. A chair out of place, a sense of disarray that spoke of a brief, intense struggle. But there was no Ruth Price. There was no intruder. The house was empty. An extensive search was launched. Neighbors were interviewed. Every lead was followed. But Ruth Price had vanished without a trace from her own home in the middle of that December night. The 911 call, which should have been the key to her rescue, instead became the central, baffling artifact of her disappearance. It was a record of a crime in progress, a real-time audio snapshot of fear, and yet it led to nothing. No body was ever found, no suspect was ever identified, no definitive explanation ever emerged. The case of Ruth Price remains officially unsolved. Later, information surfaced suggesting Ruth Price may have lived for years after the call, which challenged everything people thought they knew about that recording. If the call wasn't the end, then what was it? A moment of fear, a misunderstanding, or something that was never fully documented? The Ruth Price 911 call remains unexplained, not because it lacks sound, but because it lacks answers. And perhaps that unanswered silence is what makes it linger in people's minds.